I think
Yeah, we're live.
we're live. I think across all the
We're live.
things,
All the
um,
things.
all of the things. So we're going to start at the top of the hour in just a second. Terry and I have been distractedly chatting about all kinds of stuff in preparation for the broadcast, and so we didn't start with our normal 3 or 4 minute early walk-in. So
That doesn't matter. We could do that now if we want to.
we will. So we'll just
Yeah.
uh, ease our way into it. There's one thing I want to
This is
do.
like Monopoly. We're making up the rules as we go along.
There's rules. I know
Well,
there's
that's what I mean
rules.
by that. Yeah, we're making them up.
Um, so a couple of reminders. I know a lot of folks who have been watching Terry and I over the past few months have gotten in the habit of continuing to join in on Thursdays for a continued study of First and Second Corinthians that started all the way back a few months ago, and then we did James before that. That study time is on hold until the new year. And we'll have a new slate of studies coming out in the future based on our schedules and kind of how things shake out. We're letting some space take place. I've got some projects, he's got some projects. So again, there will not be a Thursday study, and I'll put a notice out as well about that in a couple other formats. But Terry, how are you doing today? That's the question.
Oh, I'm pretty good. I'm pretty good. I'm tired. I stayed up entirely too late, frustratingly watching the Titans pull out a win in the last 20
Oh, that's right.
seconds.
Sports ball is back.
Yeah, and look, I'm just angry this morning a little bit that we signed a kicker 11 days ago that missed 4 kicks last night. And made that entirely too difficult. But, I mean, that's first world problems, not a big deal. Just sleepy.
It's a thing.
It's a thing.
Yeah. So no special questions then for today. We'll just chit chat a little
Oh,
bit.
come on. I missed
No,
the
I don't have.
special questions.
They'll come back. They shall return next
I
week.
got one for you then. Here we go.
Oh,
Special question.
all
Yeah.
right.
What is your favorite kind of cereal you ate as a kid? And your
That's easy.
favorite as an adult? Favorite as a kid, favorite as an adult?
Well, as a kid, it's super easy. Lucky Charms. Uh,
Did you eat just the
primarily,
marshmallows? Did you eat just the
yes,
marshmallows? Yeah.
yes. Primarily because it was rarely allowed to come home from the grocery store. It
Yep.
was like the forbidden cereal. As an adult, I don't eat a ton of cereal. It's not really part of the regular cycle. And so I don't know if I have a favorite. If I am forced to select at the little breakfast opportunities at store, restaurant, hotels or whatever, it's probably going to be Honey Nut Cheerios is probably what I'll end up settling towards, or something similar to that. It's all boring and grown up. So what about you, Terry?
So as a kid, it's an odd tie between Apple Jacks, oddly. I was an Apple Jacks guy, and Life. Like I liked Life on a daily basis, Life cereal, which is odd because it's kind of good for you compared to like I don't know, Lucky Charms. As an adult, I really dig the Raisin Bran Crunch. Like it's Raisin Bran with like clusters of granola in it, and I don't eat a lot of cereal, but when I do, that's my jam, man. That or oh, what's the Raisin Bran with the nut clusters? I forget what that one's called. Not nut and honey, but anyway, yeah, that's those two. Those Raisin Bran. It's all about Raisin Bran anymore, which means I'm old, dude. When you're into bran flakes and raisins, you're old. That's the definition of
That's
old
pretty
right
much
there.
a
Yeah,
given at this point. There's
yeah,
nothing.
yeah. Now see,
You
I'm
can
bugged
do.
that I can't remember the Raisin Bran with the clusters in it.
They make this thing called Google. I think that can
I know. I'm
help you out.
googling it right now. Thanks for that. And man, I just oh, it'll probably come to me like later. You know how that goes. It's I'm old. Like I said, I am old. Oh, Raisin Nut Brand. That's it. Done. Raisin Nut Brand. That and Raisin Bran Crunch. Those are really good. Really good. Raisin Nut Brand is like the equivalent, by the way, for adults to Lucky Charms because those little clusters of the raisins and nuts, you want to eat all those and not so much the bran flakes. So there you go.
All right. So Two other things real quick. We are only sharing this on Facebook now, just on the actual Do the Work page. So folks are looking for the future. I want to encourage everyone to follow the page. That's going to be the easiest way to keep track of these episodes, especially as we go looking into next year as well. And I've been organizing all the past episodes. And so over the course of the next 2 weeks, you'll see playlists that have them all labeled out, details, what's on it, who is there, all of that's being put together for future release as well, including podcasts for those who might be modestly interested. But right now, Terry and I actually have what is a serious subject for the two of us. There are some lighthearted edges to it, but it was a thing that I thought was pretty important when we were tossing it back and forth enough to put to the top of the list. And it is not about Michael Walls.
Although we miss him.
What about Walls? We do miss. He's
we
vanished.
Miss Walls. He's gone. Well, yeah, he's been banished from the program for a while.
Yeah,
because he didn't show up for Zoomapalooza, so he's on timeout.
He chose his kids and brisket over us. I don't even.
He chose brisket. Let's be honest. He chose brisket, and that was a choice you would make too, probably. But anyway,
I would have done live from Rudy's.
You would have made us watch you eat the brisket, which gets, by the way, that idea gets exactly to what we're talking about today, which is this. We call it What About Walls, but sometimes preachers, especially if we're not careful, we compartmentalize our life from our work, and we present these two different personas in regards to our work. And the reason I say that gets to that is, man, smoked meat is something that's just you. That's who you are. And just like sports is who I am. And as silly as that is, those things are going to come through even sometimes in our sermons. I imagine those illustrations we have are going to be a part of all of that. You hear me preach, you're probably going to hear about sports sometimes.
What do you mean, like every single Kenny Moore sermon I remember?
Well, I'm no Kenny Moore, but and if you're preaching, we're going to hear about probably outdoorsy stuff like canoes, not kayaks, because kayaks are bad, I've learned, but canoes and camping and all of that stuff, because that's part of who we are. That's part of our, it's not really character as much as that's part of our personality. And I think one of the things we want to talk about is a pretty broader subject than we think about, but is maintaining your identity in your work really is probably a good way to put that, rather than putting all these walls up in different areas. And I think that's kind of important to talk about.
And one of the ironies to this, and this is something that challenged me as I was thinking through the process, is that almost any preacher I know, if not all of us, would encourage the congregation they're part of to be whom they are spiritually, whether they are at the assembly with their brethren, whether they are in their home with their families, or at work where they provide for those families and for whatever God blesses them. They want to be, they would encourage everyone to be spiritually consistent. And so moving from the preacher to the listeners, we're expecting consistency and transparency and clarity.
Yeah.
But then we look to the preacher, and for all kinds of reasons, and we're going to talk about a few, there is the expectation that you're not going to see certain things. And I think there's a layer, or not so much a layer, but a barrier that needs to be torn off right there. It's not as distinct as the veil, but I think it's probably in the same range for a lot of guys, myself included. And we're going to try to talk about at least 2 or 3 different spaces in our lives where that happens. And the first one is, at least for me, is our own spiritual failure. And we are often encouraged in speech writing, in speaking, to use different methods to either exclude or include ourselves in the message. And we might say we in the plural sense, or us in the plural sense, but we tend to be very vague when we do that. like when we sin, which is probably a good starting point to discuss a subject rather than when someone sins, because that's more distant. Um, but it's probably more powerful and more personal to say when I sin. But a lot of times there is a level of fear to write that on the page because we're not comfortable with the public component of saying not just I sinned at some unidentified space in the past, but when I sin right now and the level of maturity that I am today. We don't write it that way, let alone speak it that way if you move through the public speaking steps that in that
Yeah.
sequence.
So this going back last week to writing, and we talked about there's a difference between formal kind of writing and the kind of writing, for instance, I do in a bulletin, which is more conversational. One of the rules of writing that I was raised on, and probably you too, Phil, was you never used first person pronouns in your writing. You always tried to stick to third person. You could use second person some, but that was even discouraged. It was always a third person kind of perspective because you didn't want it to be personalized. It wasn't supposed to be about you. You're supposed to keep yourself out of it. And it's interesting because I think that's translated sometimes for us if we're not careful into our writing and our work as preachers and as in our sermon writing. I think that happens is we speak a lot of times in third and second person, but sometimes we completely avoid the first person. Here's why I think that's important for me, at least, is, James 5 tells us to confess our sins to one another. And I'm not sure that necessarily means all the dirty details all the time, but I do think that part of that is just this acknowledgement that I have sinned, that I do struggle. And sometimes there's subjects that I preach on that I am open about my struggle with those temptations and sins in a very first person sense, not even plural, not even we and us, but sometimes very much a, hey, I struggle with this. I need to hear this message. And I think sometimes as preachers, we're kind of taught, if we're not careful, to not do that. Don't let people into the inner chamber of your heart. Kind of keep them away because some might even say, look, people don't want to listen to a speaker who has those kinds of flaws, has those kinds of mistakes. And I do think that I probably was raised on a style of preaching that at least, I'm not 100% certain, but I could say this, it sure felt like it was that kind of approach that we don't let people see any chinks in the armor, kind of that never let them see you sweat kind of mentality, right? And I just got to tell you, I think today that people kind of need to know, hey, I'm not perfect. Now, that doesn't mean I get up and list every dirty sin I've ever committed. It doesn't mean every sermon I list a sin. But there are times where it is appropriate to say, this is a struggle. I struggle with this. And you probably do too. And it's okay because God wants to help us. I mean, that's a much better message than, hey, Phil, you're going to struggle with this and I've got this figured out. And if we're not careful, when we build up a wall here, kind of develop this inner sanctum of our heart that doesn't ever let any of these flaws out, that's what comes across to people in the pew is that, well, he's got it all together. And that I think that's a dangerous thing because, look, I don't have it all together, and I know you don't have it all together. We're all works in progress. We're trying to do the best we can. Let's be real about that, and let's be open and honest about that.
Yeah, and I think that's an area where it's not just a preacher thing. I think it also appears in shepherds.
Yeah.
I know it also appears in servants, deacons, Bible class teachers. There are some emotional and cultural barriers to being open about our spiritual place. And I think we need to fix that. And there are illustrations in the Old Testament that serve as an insightful look into our character in relation to God. And throughout the Psalms, you see a much more open dealing with individual sin. And remember this is something that I just kind of captured recently. David is writing all the Psalms that he's attached to very often from a first person perspective. He is serving in that same time frame as being the king of Israel, and yet he's open about his failure. And so as much as there is a lot of a lot going on with David as king and how he is a man after God's own heart. We tend to pick and choose which parts of David we like in that area. And then we say, okay, this is how you be a man after God's own heart. You only do the 8 things I found in David that I like. Well, one thing no one likes about David is that he has sinned. And one thing that I think we need to probably do better is appreciate that lament, that sorrow is part of the spiritual development of us as believers. And that means when we preach, that sorrow has a space too, that spiritual conflict in regards to our sins, the kind of conflict that causes us to turn to God, not just weep.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I compare this, by the way, to the idea of the anonymous groups. When somebody is struggling, they find the fellowship often. Let's say they're struggling with alcohol. They go to AA. They find the fellowship in AA to convince them they can overcome their alcohol addiction. But the key to that is the fellowship they find from other people who don't say, I'm no longer an alcoholic and here's how you can handle this. They say, I'm an alcoholic. I've been sober this long. I'm one bad moment away from losing my sobriety. And that kind of open and honesty that builds that fellowship. I don't see that any different for us. That what we need in this fellowship to help each other overcome sin is this communication. Now, it doesn't, again, I think so much about this is key, by the way, Phil, and all this today is just to mention over and over again, there is a balance to this. There's a time to be filtered. We're just saying there's a time not to be so filtered. Maybe that's the best way to put that.
Well, and one of the things I try, I know Terry does the same thing in my speaking work when I write out my outlines and my manuscripts, is to use my voice.
Yeah.
And in social media interaction, I try to use my voice. But I want to just kind of stretch the idea a little bit bigger and say, I want it to be where if someone only met me through my writing or through my social media interaction, they're not going to be surprised when they meet me in person and go, well, I never would have expected that because they couldn't see that beforehand. I try not to move in that way in those two spaces. I think in our preaching, and we'll narrow it down, like we're speaking, we're giving a lesson, we're teaching a class, we sometimes think we can't be that level of whom we are. And there's an evangelist I know who does really good work, who I like him and his family. But I remember listening to him talk to me and then listening to him preach, and it was 2 entirely different voices. He had his speaking voice, and then he had his conversational voice. And it's not just speaking style or words and whatever. The timbre, the tone, the pitch of the voice all changed. And then a few years down the road, I was at a Bible study, and an older guy was doing the Bible teaching for that class. And all of a sudden, he opens up his mouth to teach. I hadn't really spent much time around him, and that's that guy. And had I not been in the same room, I would have assumed that it was the same person. But when I went and talked to the other gentleman, the older guy, his voice didn't change. That was his voice. That was who he was.
Yeah, I had the preacher voice at one time. That was hard to overcome. It is. It is. But that's a great illustration of what we're talking about.
And I get it. Like, I struggled and struggled with it. I tried really hard to keep my California tone from when I was growing up. I fought against Southern idioms for a very long time.
No, come on in. There's room for you.
And good Brother Walls just asked me, hey, where are your favorite preachers all live? They're all from the South. Those are the guys I love listening to. She's like, why are you fighting it? Be who you are. You live there. You're preaching there. You're around those guys. Be who you are, and be content with that. And I think that's the next step that I think we should take, is to think about it from maybe an emotional standpoint. Do folks respond to things in different ways? Me, especially up until the time when my mom passed, for me to cry in any context, it was just not going to happen after I got out of high school. Like I cried a lot as a kid, um, but as I got older, culture said to me, "You don't cry," and so I accepted that, and boom, you don't cry. And I don't think there's probably not more than just a very few instances from graduation of high school until my mom passed, where one hand, I shed significant tears. It doesn't mean I wasn't grieving. It doesn't mean I wasn't sorrowful, but tears are just not the way that I process that. Now, after my mom passed, I will cry at random things that don't seem sad to others, and it is what it is. But there's other folks that Terry and I know that their emotions in that area are boom out there. You see it instantly, you know it instantly. And so if they get to a place where they're not being emotional, when I know that they're typically a pretty emotional person, it's not genuine. And I'm using sorrow as an illustration, not sorrow as the subject.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead and admit I could dry at the drop of a hat sometimes. It's just crying's not. But here's something in common that goes back, I think, to my dad dying when I was 16, and I remember walking my mom down the aisle at my wedding and cried the entire way. And it's just one of those deals where that happens. For me to try to get up and preach, say, a funeral of a very close friend and not fight that emotion is not genuine. That's just not who I am. At the same time, let me say, it would not be genuine for me to manufacture tears for somebody I did not know. And I think that's a key to this too, is not just the balance of knowing when, but also what we're talking about here is authenticity, not something that is manipulative and manufactured. And that's what the key is to all of this. Don't get up and use emotions in the pulpit that aren't genuine, but don't necessarily compartmentalize them and not use them at all and come across as this kind of trained robot that has no emotions. That's kind of the idea.
We look at trained actors who are studied and to entertain, to inform, to educate, to manifest history into a personalized way. There's a component of that formal training that builds their ability to tap into their genuine emotions, to display imperfect representations of it for entertainment, like I said, or education. And I wouldn't say it's manipulative because they're not doing it in that regard, but they're not really genuine. They're not sad about the thing they're talking about being sad about per se. And yet, we understand that those really emotive speeches and monologues and tearjerkers that are performed by those top level actors, they draw on our hearts. So if we can see it in the false world of entertainment and acting, it has a place in the real world of preaching and teaching. And there's a spot for it there. And we're going to change in life. Like Terry and I pointed out, and I think Edwin's commenting as well, as we mature through lives that are all different, we're going to be impacted in new ways that should be kind of relevant to our message and who we're talking about. And look, some things hurt. Some sermons hurt to prepare, and they hurt to preach, and they hurt to listen to while you're preaching it.
Yeah, if you get up and speak about the crucifixion in any detail at all, and it doesn't bother you a little bit, and by that what I mean is not manufactured, but really bother you. I mean, I have a sermon about the crucifixion I literally hate to preach because it talks about the real agony he went through. And the reason I hate to preach that is because I know that's because of me. I know I caused that. That's painful to relive every time. and I just, and if we're not careful, by the way, we become so desensitized that we don't feel that anymore. And I think that's the danger of all of that.
Yeah.
And not only do I not want us to be desensitized by the death of Jesus and the pain and agony he has suffered, I don't want us to act like we've been desensitized so that the congregation thinks, wow, they're crying. And that's the thing is in that sermon I preach, it's emotional for everybody else. If I got up there and almost was joyous about this while they're crying, that's a problem. Like that's an issue. And we need to make sure that we present the correct kind of emotions for the time.
And then we've talked about a couple of serious edges of it. I want to include one more, and Terry hinted at this early on. Probably for the first 10 to 12 years of my public preaching work, maybe even further than that, I had a perspective that this was super, super serious all the time. And I still have that same level of dedication to it. But a couple of years ago, my wonderful sister-in-law was visiting the church here, and she commented offhandedly, wait, Phil's telling jokes now? He's funny again? And I had recognized that I was totally comfortable in non-preaching settings with being someone willing to laugh and joke and enjoy aspects of life, but it was never in my preaching. And all of a sudden I was like, well, why is that? Like, why am I doing that? And I realized that if I can see humor in the scriptures, and I can see humor in life, and I can see God using the literary concepts of humor to teach, then there's a place for it too in the preaching, in part because that's a part of who I am. And that needs to be there too. And yes, caution needs to be, you can get in a lot more trouble with humor than you can with seriousness. And so you got to be very careful with comedy in the pulpit for sure. But there's nothing wrong with it as an abject standard. Like it is there, and it's biblical in its origin. And so as an illustration, don't do that. Don't keep that out if that's part of whom you are, but be wise in your implementation of it. Be modest in your approach to these areas.
Don't turn your sermon into a stand-up routine. That's and we've seen that. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
But when you and I started preaching, I think you're the same way, and you might have been a little more because I'll explain this in a minute. When we started preaching, there was just kind of this general rule in the church that emotions had no place in the church. There was a lot of teaching against what was labeled emotionalism at that time. You and I are about the same age when we started, so that's why I say I think you remember those kinds of ideas. But I worked with a guy in my internship who used to say the thing about emotions is if you imagine that emotions are a dog, you got one side that wants to let the dog run all over the neighborhood and have no boundaries. But then the extremist reaction is, and this is what a lot of people were doing back then, they take the dog and they actually put his legs against the tree and tie his legs to the tree so he can't go anywhere. And the key was to build a fence and let the dog roam naturally within the proper boundaries. And I think that's a great way to kind of view that idea of the use of emotions. And the same guy, it was Wilson Adams, told me that there was a reason for knowing people could laugh together, because if they can laugh together, they would be able to cry together too, because those things are connected. And I think that one of the negativities, and by the way, the fear of the emotionalism was historically that there were some groups that operated just off of their emotions and not off of truth in that sense. And so as a kind of an extremist reaction, this has no place anywhere. But the reality is emotions are such an important of not only who we are, but the fellowship we share. Like we need to be able to laugh together and to cry together. That's what being a family is all about. That's what fellowship is really about in that sense. And by eliminating that, and by the way, I have humor in my sermons a lot because that's just who I am. That's what I do. But one of the things I think is important about that in this sense is it's got to be contained. It's got to be done the right way and don't go too far, right? But it's got to be who you are. And I've gone to places in meetings where I've literally said something funny and it's like crickets, like nobody responds. I'm sure you've had that experience too, Phil. And I'll actually stop and go, guys, that was funny. It's okay to laugh in church, like because I think people are really still uncomfortable with that. But that's just who I am. That's my personality. I can't change that any more than you can change referencing tacos. That's just not gonna happen. That's who we are. And so if a couple of reasons to talk about this because we're getting close to when we need to draw it up is one to the preachers that are listening. Make sure you're yourself. Like, don't close those parts off of yourself. Be willing to be open and honest and let your personality shine through. And if you have an emotional response to what you're talking about for whatever reason it is, don't be afraid of the emotional response. Now keep it in check and don't let it run you and don't try to find the emotional response. But don't restrain it. Let it take its course naturally. And to the member in the pew or in the seat, allow the guy that's speaking to you, whether that's your Bible class teacher, your shepherds, your deacons, in whatever circumstance, environment, your evangelist, whatever it is, allow them and encourage them to be themselves. Don't expect them to be somebody else or to be this stoic kind of person who has no feelings and has no personality, that when he gets up in the pulpit, we want somebody who's just stiff and in a three-piece suit and doesn't act like himself. Don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah.
And that's I think a real purpose for what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and this is a way to think about it. And I'm going to one more time turn back to the illustration of sorrow because it's something that I think is a real barrier. As much as we don't want to overly rejoice, I think a lot of times we're uncomfortable, especially as men, grown men, crying in public. I think most guys probably struggle with that. We wipe our tears off really quick and we try to make it not be real. But if you think about it this way, God doesn't give us joy instead of sorrow, nor does he give us joy in spite of sorrow. He provides for us joy in the midst or in the middle of sorrow, because this is not about joy becoming the substitution for sorrow. It's about you and I being transformed, and he transforms our sorrow into joy. In John chapter 16, Jesus uses a woman who's giving birth as an illustration of this principle. He talks about it in very simple ways when he says, when a woman is giving birth, verse 20, off the end of saying, your sorrow will turn to joy. Verse 21, when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also you have sorrow now. And then Jesus goes on to talk about the joy that will come when we see him. That principle, I think, is one of the powerful teaching moments where our emotions, whatever they may be in the context of our understanding and circumstances, become the fuel that drives us to the good places God has designed for us. And we're not discarding reason. Reason and emotion live together with the bigger aspect of who we are. And we need to really do a better job of pushing down those barriers that say, well, no one needs the pulpit. There are 5 or 6 emotions you can't use anymore. You have them and they may be significant and God may recognize them, but you can't use that in the message and you can't be that person. Certainly there are times when I may not be the right person to present a sermon. Certain times Terry is not the right guy, but it's not because of how we're feeling. It's because of other factors that might be the process to decide who's the best person on that day to present this message to glorify God. Last thoughts, Terry?
I just think use Paul as an example. We see when we read Paul, he lets his personality come through. Jesus lets his personality come through. And, Paul especially makes some real personal pleas in his letters. You and I talked beforehand how in Corinthians you kind of see that throughout. I think about Romans 9 where he talks about that he had such a love for his countrymen that he would rather suffer so they would obey and submit to God if that was possible. He doesn't hide from those kind of things. And I may be reading too much into some of the stories of Jesus, but I could see Jesus speaking through his tears at times. I don't think that his speaking was this stoic kind of thing that we often think. And I just encourage guys to think about that and just, like we said, be yourself. Don't build up these walls. Building up the walls will end up building a wall between you and some brethren and non-brethren, people that are prospects. It will keep you from being able to teach people that need to be taught. And that's the real danger of all of this.
Well, we don't have as large of a horn to go around. That will return. I think a few mega zooms might come back. Those were a lot of fun. But I want to thank everyone for participating in the dialogue and the conversation today. Really appreciate the comments, especially appreciate Edwin calling it like it is in regards to...
No, stop. No. I just want to announce that I am taking applications for best friend status. It was formerly held by Edwin Crozier. He has been fired today. You're fired. That just ridiculous comments by Crozier today. It's just ridiculous. Yeah, he'll
understand the payment for that is not very high. You actually usually spending more in that relationship than you gain.
I don't know about that.
Either way, we do appreciate everybody. Terry, you have a great day. Everyone else have a great day. If there's some way that Terry and I can help you in your work of preaching, please let us know. We're happy to serve in any capacity, and we'll be able to direct our answers to whomever is smarter than us too, because sometimes that's what happens.
Jared,
take care, everybody. And